Hey guys, welcome back to Total Tactics FPL. It's Fran here and I'm back with my Gameweek 21 wildcard. This is going to be the first variation of the wildcard I'll show. I will show kind of tinkerings and variations where if you want to go a little bit more aggressively, use the money you have in the bank and maybe create a little bit more of a stronger team on paper, then you can do so. I've actually kept a lot of money in the bank because my plan is still to bench boost in 22, and I feel like this team still has a very strong output in 21 as well as 22. And as we know, the double game weeks are going to be Crystal Palace and Norwich for a double up for West Ham, and then Everton get to play Brighton and Leicester. Now, Leicester and Southampton both had cancelled games. Leicester will now be playing Everton in a single game week, and then Southampton will be playing Brentford in a single game week. Brentford also have a double game week, but I'm just not that interested in the permanency of any kind of Brentford players, just because I think that they have dropped off considerably since the start of the season. And I'm not really interested in a Brentford defender at this point in time because I only plan on playing the bench boost in 22. Now, the logic of my wild card was first to make sure that I actually have two City players. I do actually think that that they are the best team in the league, and defensively, we've seen that also panned out in the statistics. Laporte has also done incredibly well from an underlying stats point of view in terms of how he's actually taking advantage of these set pieces. And with John Stones and his kind of unknown injury, there is a lot of scope for Laporte to play games. Even early in the season, when John Stones was actually very fit for games, we did actually see a long patch where Laporte was actually playing ahead of him. And I imagine that will actually stay the same for the remainder of the season. And there could be rotation at sudden times, and maybe I might not be interested in Laporte at one point in time, but I'm pretty confident Laporte is a good option at this point in time. As far as the keepers, the decision between De Gea and someone like Lloris was mostly due to the fact that De Gea is a little bit more interesting from an FPL point of view because of the fact that he will probably make more saves within a game, whereas Lloris is actually now playing in quite a compact defense and doesn't actually face many saves. So yes, even though there are probably higher probabilities for De Gea to actually lose his clean sheet, I think what interests me about De Gea is the fact that he can kind of miraculously save games from an FPL point of view. So if you look at the loss, for example, or rather the draw versus Newcastle as an example, he did get 5 points in that game. So that was a really, really beneficial plus, right, for owning De Gea. And since Conte has actually come into the team, De Gea and Lloris have actually scored very, very similarly in terms of points. I believe De Gea is 1 or 2 points ahead, actually. So that actually is quite interesting because we know the United defense haven't been anything special, yet De Gea has still outscored Lloris during a run where Spurs have showcased a very, very strong defense. I've gone Reguilon, even though my suggestion is probably to go safely for Davies. The thing I like about Reguilon the most is his underlying stats really blow most of the fullbacks in the league out of the water. And for me, it's more of a fitness thing. We did note that around 17th of December that Conte made a press conference where he did say that Reguilon was kind of struggling from injuries. And maybe it does seem like Reguilon has some fitness issues as per now, but I think he is someone who will work hard and probably try to make sure that he actually keeps that starting spot in the team. And even though Sessegnon does come back and that could be a threat to Reguilon, I just think the upside of Reguilon is still very present, and I do prefer him over Emerson. If you want to play it safe and you want to maybe go for a different structure, as I will show later in the video, you can definitely go for Davies. Trent and Cancelo, as I've always said, are non-negotiables. Cancelo seems to actually be available for the Arsenal game, so he's probably someone I would actually like to play in that game. Lowton is someone who we look towards in the future, where in Game Week 22, there's a very, very high probability that Burnley will have a game rescheduled in Game Week 22. And this is simply due to the fact that they have actually been a participant of the most postponed games in the league, and it means that they're pretty much guaranteed to have what really should be a double game week in 22. So since the fixtures for the postponed games aren't too bad for Burnley, I do think that Lowton can be quite an explosive pick just off of the bench boost. He is going to be that X factor though, because going forwards from Game Week 22, Lowton isn't a very good asset, and that's going to be the gamble, I guess, in this team. With Bowen, we know what he's provided. We just saw a fantastic performance from him versus Watford, where he was really dominating that defense. Once again, Watford are a very, very poor defense, but that's not too dissimilar from his opponent in Norwich, right? And having a double game week with Crystal Palace is also going to be a huge plus. One thing that is a little bit tricky with Bowen and Antonio is going to be who you put the captain over. I think it is a genuine 50-50. I think Bowen is clearly the form player, but I do think the fixtures actually benefit Norwich. I think Norwich have really struggled versus central threats lately. If you actually look at the last 4 to 5 fixtures, Norwich have consistently given most of their opposing strikers 1 goal, 1 assist, or even 1 goal. And those kind of performances are pretty much primed for an Antonio who, in the past, of course, as we've seen, has done extremely well versus Norwich. I do think that with Bowen, the one kind of detriment is the fact that they do have an FA Cup game sandwiched between these two double game weeks. So that could be a scope for Bowen to actually play maybe in the FA Cup game, and that might preclude him from the second fixture. Or maybe he plays less minutes in the second fixture. But I still think they're probably both nailed on to play at least something like 150 minutes or 160 minutes over the course of those two games. Antonio should definitely be rested for the cup game, which probably means that Antonio might be my favorite captain. But we'll talk about that more in a sec when I actually show the Gameweek 21 lineup. As far as Son, I think he's once again a non-negotiable during this period where if we are wildcarding now, I think it's very wise to move away from Salah because he is going to AFCON and you are going to miss him for 3 to 4 weeks, potentially a double game week fixture as well for Liverpool in 22. And Son has a double game week in 22. And he's also probably just a little bit more better value for money than Kane. And during this time where a lot of forwards are very, very interesting, where maybe someone like Watkins is a name that isn't mentioned, that isn't on this wild card, that probably still interests a lot of managers, or someone like Tony, if you're going for a bit more of a short-term punt, it interests you as managers. We now have a plethora, basically, of forwards who are interesting. And I think Son is the true premium midfielder here, where he has a double game week and is generally worth keeping your team. Ronaldo and Kane are once again going to be topics that I'll have to go through, but we'll discuss about that more in a second. Gray for me is interesting because there is a strong possibility, if you look at Ben Krellin's Twitter, that Everton have a double game week potentially as well in 22. So that's a very, very good big plus for someone who has provided a very good season so far. Now, Gray is one of the few players in this team who doesn't have very, very good underlying stats, but he still is behind Richarlison as the second most kind of high producing, efficient player for underlying stats and expected goal involvements for this Everton team. And Richarlison being out is going to be a huge plus to him because I think Townsend is still potentially out for the game, and Gray is going to be that second talisman behind DCL. If they do have back-to-back double game weeks, then Gray and DCL for me are a fantastic double up, and I really don't think there's anything wrong with Gray particularly because he's very, very cheap. Worst case scenario, I can probably move him towards a 4.4 in the future, or actually push him up with all the money I have in the bank into someone like Foden, who could actually come back into the side. Now, we haven't really discussed Foden, but I think Foden has actually been confirmed by some reputable sources to actually be injured. Now, I don't actually vouch for those sources myself. I'm not myself sure of whether Foden's available to play, but I don't really want to make that mistake again where the last time I did a wild card, I kind of went for DCL even though I wasn't sure he was going to play, and it kind of did ruin my draft and made me try to look away from him. COVID is probably not going to affect Foden too much. He probably is going to actually be available for the subsequent game versus Chelsea, but that's not a great fixture as well. I think that right now you're probably looking at someone like KDB or Sterling, or just kind of going away from the Man City midfielders completely because Gundogan and Bernardo just aren't that interesting at this point in time, and Mars is leaving to AFCON. So that's exactly why I've actually gone for Maddison. Maddison has the game versus Everton, and he also has the double game week potential with at least Burnley and then probably Tottenham. Even though Tottenham is going to be a tough game, we know that this Leicester side have been able to score versus all sorts of teams, including Liverpool and City, and I think that's basically a justified enough reason to actually go for Maddison. Now, there could be a big possibility that Leicester are missing their forwards within these games because Iheanacho is going to AFCON and Daka and Vardy are still injured. But I still think that Maddison will play a very advanced role for this team and provide a lot in what should be easier fixtures within Everton and Burnley. As for Jota, once again, I think he's a non-negotiable. I'll probably skip from him. He's someone I really do see as a season keeper, especially if Firmino doesn't get too many minutes over the next few weeks. And with the kind of African players heading towards AFCON, you've got a big plus there in Jota being what should be a focal point, maybe alongside Firmino during those kind of 3 to 4 game weeks. As far as Dennis, he's someone that I've brought into the team and kind of kept, right? Because King was someone who was in my team. I had the double up of Watford, but it just doesn't really make sense to go with these two Watford players into the wild card, especially when we have a lot of, I think, sample size to really show that Dennis really, really surpasses King on the eye test. I still think King is a great option if you actually can only afford King. King is someone who definitely will get penalty involvements over the course of the year. He has also provided a lot of goal involvements himself. I don't actually think King in isolation is a bad asset. It's just that when you actually compare him to Dennis one-on-one, I still think Dennis ranks supreme. And Dennis missing AFCON is going to be a huge plus for this Watford team who really, really direly need him. He will also have a double game week fixture as well as very, very good subsequent fixtures in game week 23, such as the Norwich game where you'd probably like to have Dennis in your team. And what I like about this team too is that if you, let's say, roll a transfer on 22, By game week 23, you can already move the team towards a structure where maybe, let's say, if you want to avoid Son and his game versus Chelsea, you could go straight into a City team, right? Featuring a double up of Kevin De Bruyne and someone else in the team, using that kind of money in the bank. And maybe you could save, once again, the money in the bank so you can go into Son, or Salah, sorry, when he returns. But I think KDB is a great pivot away from Son if you don't really fancy him in the Chelsea game, where I actually do think that Chelsea will probably keep a very good defensive display versus Tottenham, even though Tottenham are rather in form. So that's kind of how I see things right now. This team gives a lot of flexibility. You can make moves away from DCL very simply as well with the money in the bank. You can even go for an easy pivot to Watkins if he, let's say, doesn't have a double game week, if he didn't play well in this double game week too. You can also maybe make moves away from the defense if you want. Robertson is a possibility in game week 22 as well if someone is extremely dismaying or if someone suffers an injury. So those are all possibilities there, and that's what I really like about this team and the capacity for us to bench boost in 22. So now if we actually look at how we fielded out in game week 21, I actually think that the bench is going to be Laporte, Dennis, Lowton, and Sanchez in that specific order. What I like about this order is that for me, Cancelo will either play the game or not play the game, and that means that Laporte will come into the side. Cancelo is actually traveling to the Arsenal game. I don't imagine that he'll feature if he's on the bench to start with, and Laporte is someone who can come in and replace him very, very well. As far as Dennis, the kind of decision was between him and Maddison, and I just think that Maddison has a nicer game versus Everton than Dennis does versus Tottenham, even though Dennis has performed exceedingly well over the course of the year. They're both assets who have done incredibly well. The underlying stats are actually very, very good for both Dennis and Maddison, but as I said, Maddison is definitely a little bit more interesting just because the Everton defense, in my opinion, is a much more fragile one than the Tottenham one. And Jota is probably another decision maker that people were looking at just because the fixture is kind of bad. But I do think that especially at a time where Chelsea are struggling from injuries and struggling from poor form, this is a great fixture for Jota to actually play, and hopefully he can actually get a goal contribution for us there. Lowton once again sits at the back of the bench because he's someone that we're going to bring in as part of the bench boost. The same kind of with Sanchez, where he'll probably fill in for future games where maybe De Gea isn't so interesting, doesn't have great fixture, or maybe has a blank. But for the meantime, Sanchez is just going to be that alternate keeper. So that's it for the Game Week 21 kind of playing team. So we did mention that we'd actually look at team variations as well. And I actually think that there is a possibility to actually spend the money in the bank if you'd like. I will definitely propose going for someone like a Davies instead of Reguilon because he actually will save you money. He also kind of avoids you from the kind of conundrum of Reguilon being substituted at 45 minutes. That was a big warning sign, I would say, for any future Reguilon owners, including myself, as someone who actually bought in Reguilon in Game Week 20, that he could be rotated, especially since Sessegnon can come back into the team. But I do think that Reguilon will find his way back into the team with good performances, and hopefully he will get to keep his starting spot in the team. As far as other players, you can actually go for De Bruyne, as I said, to actually spend the maximum amount of money. That leaves you with 5.3 in the bank. You probably might have more value, maybe less value. The options here are quite plentiful. You can actually go for someone like a Cucurella at this point in time, but I don't really fancy the Brighton double up, even though their double game weeks are not too bad, supposedly. And then you can also go for Matty Cash, but I don't really like the fixture versus United as a basis for the 22, even though they probably will also face Burnley, which should be a nice match. We do know that Aston Villa, in my opinion, don't have the best stats for post-Gerrard, even though their expected goals conceded is somewhere around the mid-table. I just think that Cash hasn't provided enough from an attacking point of view since that Everton game where he basically rinsed Luka Dean to actually be worthwhile in our teams. And he kind of sits at that price range where he becomes the third most expensive defender in your team. And you might be wondering why you'd really want him in your team. So that is going to be a big question mark. You could obviously go for an alternative where maybe you go for Shaw as well and then go for Jose Sa. That's another possibility too. Or you can kind of flip that around and go for De Gea and then go for someone like a Cody if you just want a little bit of security from your bench from a Wolves defender, because Wolves, we know, are a fantastic defensive team and they've showcased that already within this first half of the season. So it makes a lot of sense potentially to actually hedge yourself with a Wolves defender who can always come in these kind of green fixtures and provide you with a clean sheet. As I said, there is also an option of going for Sterling, and Sterling is a little bit of a positive because with Foden out with COVID potentially, and then Mahrez going to AFCON, you actually don't have much rotation within the front three players. You have Jesus, you've got Grealish, you've got Foden, who will be playing over this AFCON period, and Sterling will easily find, in my opinion, a lot of starts within this kind of run, especially since there's enough games to rest. And I actually think that, I mean, he has been potentially the most professional member in that kind of front line so far alongside Jesus. So that's going to be a big plus. And you'll also have 2.0 in the bank to maybe upgrade your defender as well. This could also kind of keep Reguilon in your team if you actually fancy Reguilon, and also gives you maybe money to upgrade someone like Gray into the future. You could also go for an alternative where, let's say, if you go for someone like Emerson, that does give you enough money in the bank to maybe upgrade someone like Gray in the near future as well, or even upgrade someone like Bowen back into a Foden. So that is an option as well. It really is completely up to you how you kind of play around this with this wild card. It also depends on how you plan to attack the double game week of 22, right? So if you don't really want to bench boost, or if you've already used your bench boost, you can probably go for a structure like this instead, because it probably fits a single game week team a little bit better. You probably have enough playing double game week players within 22 regardless, because you're not going to be reliant on a bench. And those are kind of the variations you have as well. Once again, with the forwards, you can also play around with players like Watkins if you don't really fancy DCL, because he could be a risk, right? Coming back after 4 months of not playing, he didn't really play since game week 3. That's a huge kind of risk to take. So you can go for Watkins, who does have a guaranteed double game week in 22. So those are your options right now. I hope you guys have a wonderful time, and I'll probably see you guys in the deadline stream very shortly.